It's with me, of course. No, I was just shedding light on the Jack Lesley campaign, and obviously you've got the fantastic statue outside at Home Park, of course, and this book, which Matt has fantastically written and really brought Jack's wonderful life to life, really. Done a fantastic job with it, and I hope you guys all agree when you get around to reading it, of course. So before I come to Matt, just wanted to say we're here joined by the National Football Museum as well. They'll be live streaming this show, and it'll be going live on their channels over the coming weeks, I'm sure, I think the beginning of November. But yeah, I'd just like to kick off by raising a glass, obviously not drinking, of course, but clapping a round of applause for the author of this book. It's Matt Tiller.
Cheers, Richard. There's a few people to thank, but I'll start with you because I met Richard very briefly at the unveiling, and then you wrote a piece for The Athletic, and I was really blown away by it. I thought it was beautiful and really insightful, and I thought I needed that on this journey. Richard is obviously a football expert, and I'm not. I'm now almost an expert on Argyle's history from 1921 to 1934. But beyond that, I'm not an expert. So that was really helpful. But also, there's some stuff that we'll talk about, not just the call-up, but through Jack's career, where I felt I couldn't write about it. And we chatted about a lot of stuff, and it helped massively and impacted on the text in a really positive way. So I want to thank you hugely. Also, I have to thank Greg Foxsmith, my co-founder of the Jack Lesley campaign, because without him, none of this would have happened, and he's been incredibly supportive. And there's a few other people in the room who have helped. John Eales, who's a massive Argyle fan, and on top of the Argyle stats, proofread, and was just really helpful spotting, potential errors that I could have made. Steve at Greens on Screen, if you've ever checked out Greens on Screen, or if you haven't, please do, because without that website, which is phenomenal, going through all the seasons and all the games would have been really tough. And Matt and Bob from the Plymouth Argyle Heritage Archive, also incredibly helpful, and some of Matt's photos are in the book. They found some fantastic medals that Jack would have had in his collection had he not given them away. I'd also like to Callum and Andy from the university who interned on the book. That was really helpful, just doing extra research. And all of you for supporting the campaign. Thank you. There's a few really special people that I'd like to thank and introduce. In the front we have Gloria and Tracy. Now, Gloria is the daughter of Jack's striking partner, Sammy Black, and Tracy is his granddaughter, and they really were spoken of in the same breath as a partnership that, it was amazing that Argyle had them, but really ran defences ragged and should have been playing in the top tier. And finally, I want to say a huge thanks, and I hope we'll be hearing from them a little this evening, Lesley and Lyn, two of Jack's granddaughters. Please give them a round of applause because they have been immense through this. And without their honesty and telling all their family stories, this wouldn't exist. So thank you hugely. And to Jill, the youngest granddaughter, who's been looking after her partner Graham, who's been a staunch supporter. And we've had some really good news that he's been in hospital for treatment for a serious illness, and he's coming through, responding really well. So I'm so pleased to hear that. It's great news. So, yeah, I guess we better crack on talking about.
Let's talk about it. I think we might have to sit down for this, but we'll try our best to amplify our voices up there.
Well, I don't mind standing. Yeah. I could carry on.
Let's own the stage.
Yeah, okay, let's do it. Yeah. Well, there isn't a stage. That's why we're having to stand up.
Very true.
But yeah, no, let's do it.
So first of all, what was your motivation for starting the book and getting it up and running?
Well, the whole thing started with that bloke over there, Tony Fitzgerald, who I met in a bar, and Argyle fans sort of gravitate together, particularly when we're outside of Plymouth, because it was in London, and we just started chatting. And well, Jack Lesley's in the record books at Argyle, but and I think a lot of older fans did know the story, but it just hadn't been sort of flagged up and passed down. But Tony was. Sorry, I've just called you old there, Tony. Oh,
Sorry.
yeah, that's okay, Peggy. Yeah, he started telling me the story with such enthusiasm, and I just thought immediately I had to sort of look into it, and I found a few articles online and found out, this actually happened. Because I at first thought an Argyle player called up for this must be one of those stories that's sort of blown up out of all proportion, and but it was there, and that's what led to the campaign. When I started talking to mates like Greg, Argyle fans who were shocked that they hadn't heard the story when they were growing up, because we were sort of fans in, well, still are, but started in the sort of mid-late 80s. So, and it wasn't talked about until very recently.
So how did you go about forming, the methodology of doing the research? Because I mean, some almost 100 years old, some older. So how did you get it all together, and what was the process in doing that?
Well, at the start there were a lot of very helpful people. There were a few sort of articles online. No one had dug really deeply, but there was one academic who had done some work on another player, and he touched on Jack Lesley, and he shared his stuff with me. And then Bill Hearn, who is co-author of a book called Football's Black Pioneers, and it was all stories of every black player, first black player for every league club. And of course, Jack is Plymouth's first black player. And they went into it with the same, as Bill and his co-author David went into Jack's story with the same kind of thought process. It's one of those stories that's been kind of exaggerated over the years, and found it to be true. And again, he shared his stuff with me, and then I went from there. I just sort of got slightly obsessed and going into the newspaper archive online. So I found out more and more about it, and then since the statue's been unveiled, doing this has been brilliant. So I've been digging into papers and reading match reports from the time, and finding out more stuff, and going into the FA archives as well. So yeah, I'm sure there's more stuff out there, but it's been brilliant.
Fantastic. And obviously we'll come into the story very shortly, but when you found out what you found out and the whole process around it, were you surprised that it wasn't a story that is probably more mainstream as I guess it is now?
I think I'm not surprised, just because of what we know about. There's so many of these stories that have been kind of hidden away, or just people haven't picked up on and talked about. So there's a few stories of black footballers from even like the late 19th century, and like Walter Tull in the First World War. It probably got a lot more publicity only in recent years, but before Jack. And it's a similar kind of story, a man who sort of broke through barriers and became an officer when, the laws of the land said that wasn't, possible. Although he had a similar tale in that he was denied a medal when he was recommended by his officer for gallantry posthumously, because he died in 1918 in the First World War. So, it doesn't surprise me that it had kind of been tucked away.
No, fantastic. Okay, cool. So let's go into Jack's story now. We'll start from the beginning. Grew up in East London, and you played for Barking, which I think you're gonna bring up there. I mean, how would you describe him as a young man and as a young player as well?
Oh, it's interesting. I mean, he was obviously a phenomenally talented sportsman. It's something that Lyn and Lesley said, but there's not much record. They've got a couple of medals. Pictures of that are in the book, of him as a schoolboy footballer. But just before my deadline, we got a letter that was sent to Greg, actually, from a guy called David Jack, who is a descendant of Bob Jack, and then David Jack, who Bob Jack was Plymouth manager when Jack was around, and his son David Jack played for England, Argyle, and then went off and played for Preston and then Arsenal. Anyway, Bolton, and then thanks, Roger. Someone else I should thank for I needed my football corrections. And then there's a sort of great grandson who had this letter in his archive that was written in, I think, the late 70s from a school friend of Jack's, and said he was a great guy and phenomenally talented, won the London School Swimming Championship. So I think he was just a driven, sporting, but he was a bit naughty, wasn't he?
He could be.
I'm going to ask Lesley, yeah, go on, tell me.
Well, he was a cheeky lad, and he got into trouble quite a few times. That it added to his character.
That's I mean, they have been very honest, and there are some records of. I think he was a very sort of genuine and honest man with integrity, but he was quite mischievous, wasn't he? Yeah, not a bad thing. Is it?
Yeah, no, not at all, not at all.
So yeah, I think he was. I think he was really popular actually with. I think he had the sort of personality to win people over, which he did throughout his career.
Oh, fantastic! And you know, in his early days playing for Essex, you know, he did have an international foray, didn't he? You know, he linked up with Jules Rimet. I mean, what was the situation there?
Yeah, well, he'd after the First World War, football sort of returned, and so he signed for Barking, who were this team here, and they were one of the top teams. And within just a couple of months of playing, he got selected for a London League representative side, and Jules Rimet, who, if we're into football, we all know is one of the most famous football administrators in history, was a vice president of the London League and arranged a couple of matches, and Jack went and played in France. I mean, they lost both of them. I think a photo recently popped up and he looks a bit miserable in it. I think it's probably because he lost those games. But he was already getting, you know, as a teenager, getting picked out as a huge talent on the London scene.
As you say, a huge talent, but as Chapter 5 asks, how the hell did he end up at Argyle?
How did he end up at Argyle? I'll flick through a few pics. That one's, we were talking about going to France. This is from Normandy, when they went on, he played for Essex several times. And he actually did win a cap for Essex. We've no idea where that is, no. So he was getting recognition and honours at a very early age. And these pictures are in the book, and they're like really, I think it shows affection amongst the teammates, which
Absolutely.
I really love. But how does, this picture here is from, this is a postcard in Lesley and Lyn's sort of folder, and I thought this was remarkable, that on the back were these teams scrawled on there. And we know from various newspaper articles that he was getting interest from loads of clubs, and somehow Plymouth, who are on the list there alongside, you know, these are teams that are in the first and second division. But the manager, Bob Jack, who I mentioned, lured Jack with pictures of a sunny Plymouth seafront. Which, we're here on a wet Tuesday night at Argyle. We're normally watching games getting wet. But I think him and his parents both thought this was like a paradise. And also, players were getting the same money. There was a maximum wage, and apparently Plymouth offered Jack 10 shillings a week more than other clubs, to sign him on in the first place. So, that's Bob on the phone there, Bob Jack.
Well, I mean, if that was today, I mean, that would be all over the papers, you know, is he going for money?
Yeah.
Etc. So, obviously, very ambitious player. And when you look at the newspaper artefacts, I mean, they used to eulogise about Jack, didn't he? They were really impressed by his style of play and his endeavour and his strength and, of course, his talent. Yeah,
I mean, I think from an early stage, I mean, when he was an amateur at Barking and Essex, he was, always written up as one of the best players. And then, but it did take him a little while to establish himself at Argyle, because he was a left winger when he first came, and there was a really kind of established player in that position at Argyle. So he would be playing for the reserves, but playing in front of 5, 6, 7, 8,000. I've been to Home Park with smaller crowds than that, and was getting noted for scoring incredible goals. And he broke through a couple of times. It didn't quite happen, so it took a few years. But I think that what I admire about that is Bob Jack's sort of commitment. Other players from Barking came in, you know, lit up the pitch for a little while and then disappeared, but he stuck with Jack because I think he knew what a player he had, and then switched him to inside left, and that's where his career really started to take off.
It's interesting as well because a lot of the articles, they didn't really mention his race, did they? But when they did, you know, they say things, you know, like coloured genius and things like that. I mean, why do you think that was brought into the equation, especially in those times?
It's interesting, like the local press, there was one writer who I mentioned a lot in the book, who did mention Jack's colour when he first signed, and then he stopped and didn't mention it again until the England selection. But occasionally it would get picked out, and he was. I think it was something that obviously was a reason people picked it out, but it wasn't made a huge deal of in the papers. But there are times where there were things that I read where you kind of think, oh, that's language of the time. How do I feel? But or how, you know, you can't put today's sort of slant on it. But that's where we chatted a lot, wasn't it? I remember there was one where one of his teammates introduced him to a paper doing a tour of Argyle, and you know, he said he used a word that's often used to describe black players or black sports people, and we talked about how that might have made Jack feel. Because you remember that when Moses Russell. What did you think about that? Because I talked to you about that and really needed your help to not to make sure I didn't slip up, but to make sure that I expressed it in the right way, hopefully.
No, absolutely. I think with things like that, it's more a case of you're being seen as an other, right? So although, okay, he's noted for his talent and his ability and his qualities on the ball, and obviously he was a well-liked individual, I think when those things are brought up, is again seen as an other, you know, whereas, you know, if I was to, you know, introduce Bob Jack, for example, I wouldn't say, oh, and here's the white man, Bob Jack. You just say Bob Jack. So I guess in those days, it wasn't as more of a multicultural society, which we see today. So having that attached to his identity would have been very interesting for him. As you say, because maybe the fact he was well-liked and well-supported may not have phased him too much, but I'm sure privately he would have been like, okay, I am seen as another, and that may have affected him, you know, behind closed doors.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, you kind of, without that experience, you don't really, I mean, I can't understand that. That's why I needed you. It was, and there were a few incidents like that where, not often, but I think he did, when he talked about the abuse that he suffered when in that Daily Mail interview in 1978, he said he usually sometimes gets shouted at the pitch, on the pitch, and occasionally there were reports where he was getting barracked, but it wouldn't mention his skin colour. But I think, you know, that would always be a factor, wouldn't it?
No, absolutely. As I say, especially in those times, in that era where, you know, there was race relations probably weren't as what they are now in terms of, you know, there's a lot of division, you know, just talk of riots in those times as well. So, you know, you're thinking of a young black man moving to a new city. It's a burden. He probably would have had to think, okay, I need to, you know, do my talking on the pitch, and ultimately he did that. But of course, that brings up other questions of, you know, he had to excel and be excellent to be recognised. If he was average, would he have been celebrated the way he is today? So it's all those questions are worth asking, I feel.
Yeah, I think he had to. But there was times where Jack was targeted, and you think they expected so much from him that it would. You know, if he wasn't on absolute top form, I mean, of course that would happen to every player, but I think black players still today occasionally get targeted, I think, more quickly than other players, and I think that definitely seemed to happen to him on occasion.
Well, we talk about race and obviously Jack on the pitch. How did he settle in Plymouth off the pitch?
I think he had a great time in Plymouth generally. I think that he didn't talk about any difficult times, although I'm sure there must have been incidents. I can't believe there weren't. But he came here as a young man, and you know, 19, nearly 20, and they were, you know, a really interesting and great bunch of teammates, and I remember talking to Lesley and Lyn about some of the things that he got up to. Maybe I can ask
them. Yeah, absolutely.
what sort of things do you get up to in Plymouth?
One of the things that comes to mind is they used to hire caravans, and they'd have two, and they'd have races across the moors to see who got to which destination first, and obviously lots of drinking went on, and they just thoroughly enjoyed themselves.
Is that what you heard about Sammy, Gloria?
No. Very laid back and quiet and shy like that.
He was, yeah. I think they were quite similar characters in a way. They were quite humble and modest guys, given how talented they were on the pitch, Jack and Sammy.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, they formed a very good partnership, didn't they? And talk about internationals, which we'll come on to shortly, but Jack had another international foray, didn't he, to South America?
Yes.
Can you speak about that?
Yeah. I think this is sort of remarkable, and this is just before Sammy joined Argyle, and this pictures the Argyle team on the steamship Avon on the way to South America, which is it's just remarkable. You imagine like there were a few grumbles in the press going, oh, they're off to South America, how's this going to affect the season? I think they were doing it for the cash, but it's quite a lot of controversy in that tour, and quite tough, but it's where Jack really established himself, because I think he was able to go out there, maybe have a bit more of the manager's ear. He played in every game. Argyle played big club sides like Boca Juniors and also Argentina's side and Uruguay side, and those two teams competed in the first World Cup final just a few years later. So, and some of those players that they faced and on occasion beat were in those World Cup final teams. So Jack scored against Uruguay in a 4-0 win, and again in a 1-1 draw. So he did really, really well, and that was really the start of his sort of flourishing at Argyle. I think he was top scorer the next season, and Sammy Black joined, and they just immediately hit it off, and they flew.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, had a fantastic partnership with Sammy Black, didn't he? And I guess in today's world, we see talk of triumvirates up front. So I guess, I'm a Manchester United fan. Don't judge me, but, when I grew up watching the likes of, Rooney, Tevez, Ronaldo, for example, you look at the famous Brazil sides of, Ronaldo, Rivaldo, Ronaldinho, and you think, okay, where am I going with this? In Jack Lesley's day, of course, it was Lesley, Sammy Black, and Jack Cock. And they were a formidable trio, weren't they?
Yeah, they were incredible. I mean, Argyle always sort of struggled to find that centre forward. They had some amazing players for a season or two, and then so Jack Cock played for Plymouth Argyle, and in the mid-20s, I think one season he scored 30 odd goals. But he was almost the David Beckham of his day down here in Plymouth. He was a movie star. He was in 2 films. I've watched one of them. It was terrible. But actually, Jack Cock was pretty good in it. He was obviously a really charismatic guy. Unlike Jack, he loved singing. Jack used to perform at concerts in Plymouth, and it was quite a side. You had someone who played for England in Jack Cock, and someone who should have played for England in Jack Lesley, and someone who probably should have played for Scotland, Sammy Black.
That was quite a trio. And off the pitch, obviously Jack was with Lavinia, who became his wife in 1925. They obviously met in London before moving to Plymouth, of course. Can you explain the dynamic there? Because, they were an interracial relationship, and in those days, people may not have had the progressive views of which we have today. So, could you explain that dynamic and how it may have been like for Jack, but also his wife too?
We know that just after the war, where Jack was growing up in Canning Town, there was a much more diverse population, but after the war there were, it's described often as race riots, but actually it was just, men returning from the war targeting immigrants and particularly mixed marriages and relationships, abusing and attacking them because, they thought that they had, taken their women and their jobs. So that was all going on. Jack sort of grew up through that. Obviously, coming to Plymouth, a much less diverse place. I mean, I think, as we said, he was embraced as a footballer here. I think it was probably, in some ways, not to lessen what happened to Jack at all, some ways harder for Lavinia, Wyn, because she had a big family in London, a poorer family, and came down to Plymouth after they got married, and I think had quite a tough time. Jack was off playing football; he had that to distract him, and going off with his mates. I'd like to ask Lesley and Lyn about this, sort of how those stories have been passed down about how she was, how Wyn was treated.
She was very lonely because Grandad was off with his mates, so she used to, when they had me mum, they used to go to the beach most days. But in later life, she said to us, whatever you do, don't marry a black man. So she never mentioned the abuse she got, but from that statement we know she must have got a lot of abuse.
I mean, I found that when you told me, and I do talk about that in the book, because I found it shocking.
Yeah.
But it speaks to what she, because you, Lesley, said about some of the things that happened actually here in Plymouth.
Well, by all accounts, I mean, Grandad was a hero to many because of his footballing skills, but Nan quite often was called all sorts of horrific names because she'd married a black man. At one occasion she was spat on, and she was such a quiet person, complete opposite to Grandad, and I think it must have been so difficult for her, really difficult. And I think from what Lyn said, the problem was that if you have a mixed marriage, that child that they created isn't accepted by either community, not fully accepted. That was the big issue.
And hopefully, but I think even when I started watching football, there was such horrific abuse, and there were some of the same attitudes around. I'm sure they haven't entirely gone away.
No, not at all. But I guess when it comes to Jack, you've seen the abuse his wife is getting. How do you think that would have made him feel, integration of his teammates and in Plymouth as a wider perspective?
I think there's that irony of him being embraced and loved in Plymouth and celebrated. He really was, because he was such a key player, and footballers are loved when they're doing well for their team. They are. But I think there were sort of dips in form that sort of hit at certain points, and I think that was probably at key moments when, for example, when they had a child in 1927, baby Eve, and I think those early days would have been really, really tough for both of them. And there were odd little dips in form, and I think there were. I think they both wanted to get back to London, and Jack would have been signed by one of the big clubs in London, but Bob Jack, refused to let him go. He did love playing for Plymouth, but there's loads of reports of clubs coming in with big money offers for Jack and for Sammy Black as well, often as a pair. Jack even went on strike at one point. I don't think the strike lasted very long because Bob Jack just said, "You don't play, you don't get paid." And it's like, well, just got to go back to work. And he couldn't. I think this is also, he couldn't put up the kind of battle that other players might have been able to do. And I think the same is true of Sammy, because he just didn't have the same personality as some of the other players that we had at the time, who just made themselves a massive pain in the arse to the point where they ended up leaving, often for big money. Well,
as you say, Jack, he stayed at Argyle and excelled and continued to score the goals and continued to be a threat up front. Come on to international recognition. Let's touch on that. Let's begin there.
Yes.
How did that begin in terms of him being spotted and scouted by the England selectors at that time?
Well, I go into this in great detail. There's some lovely pictures of Jack as a very powerful presence on the pitch. And there's Jack and Sammy, which is, I think Sammy sort of arriving really made a big difference because they had such an understanding, and they're a great pair of players. Yeah, I know. Well, you see on the statue, the shorts look shorter. That's because when they actually played, they used to roll them up to be more comfortable. I don't know why they had those ludicrous shorts. Does anyone know? That's Jack's wedding. This here we are. So this photo that's also on the plinth of the statue. It's from August 31st, 1925. So start of the football season, and Argyle wins 6-2. This picture's on in the Daily Mirror, and Jack scoring, and that wheeling away from the goal in celebration kind of inspired the statue. But at that time, in September, the FA put out a call looking for recommendations for players for England. So the various kind of FA officials around the country had to sort of report back in, who should we be looking at? And ahead of the meeting on the 5th of October 1925. And Jack's name was obviously flagged up. He'd scored, I think, 6 goals in 8 or 9 games. But yeah, and Argyle were getting loads of attention because they were top of, even though they're the third division South, they were top, scored 30 odd goals, and they're in national newspapers. So when the selectors met, they chose 13 players to travel to Ireland, and Jack was named in the papers the next day as one of the 2 reserves to travel, and this was huge news. And it was only really although I sort of thought about it, a lot. It was only really when writing the book that it really made me think deeply about what that period was like, because he was called into Bob Jack's office that morning of the 6th of October, and the managers were pretty standoffish then. He was manager and secretary of the club, so he was a busy guy. Bob Jack calls Jack Lesley in, a young player. He's probably thinking, what's going on? And Bob Jack put his arm around him and told him, "You've been picked for England." And that must have been, for a young player, massive. And to then, he'd go and talk to the other players. Jack Cock, who at that point had scored the fastest goal for England on record. It's still in the top 10. And the players would have been patting him on the back, imagine in the streets, and talking to Wyn. And I think that would have been massive for them as a couple, and then for that to kind of go quiet within a couple of weeks. You think you've got this one of the biggest accolades, and not only that, even though he was named as a reserve to travel, that's one of 13 players picked for England, and every reserve to travel that I looked at when I was going through the archives, they all won a cap. And the same thing had happened to players while at Argyle, a player called Jack Hill, who moved on because he was the kind of player that would be a pain in the arse. He wanted to leave Argyle, and he was sold for a massive fee, and the FA supported Jack Hill in his bid to leave. Was Jack Lesley going to ask the FA for help in leaving Argyle? Don't think so. So yeah, when his name disappeared from the team sheet just a couple of weeks later, on the 19th of October, when there was another FA meeting, they didn't tell him. He just sort of heard, on the rumour mill. But there was no other reason. He wasn't injured. He wasn't suspended. He was never suspended in his career. And as you mentioned, on this day 98 years ago, he instead of being in Ireland, he was here at Home Park and scored twice for Argyle in a 7-2 win. So that's remarkable in itself that he bounced back like that.
No, absolutely. Just before we touch on the deselection and his thoughts and feelings, you spoke about Wyn earlier, and what she was going through, how, maybe it's probably one for you guys as well, like how would she have felt with Jack's international recognition? No, it would have been a case of, well, he's going to play for England. Would she have felt that she would have got more recognition for that as well, and more, being more accepted in society afterwards?
I don't think we've ever discussed it with our nan. It was a subject that perhaps was too painful, and it was never brought up. So I'm afraid I can't help you with that. I don't know.
Well, absolutely. It's one of those things where it becomes a sore subject, and I guess if it's not brought up, it's difficult to try and convey those thoughts and feelings. But I mean, we can only imagine if you have such an accolade and it's taken away from you.
Yeah.
It would have been terrible for the family.
Well, I remember you sort of, Lesley and Lyn saying about how angry your mum was. I think that it sort of passed through. So I think it would have, well, it certainly, if nothing else, would have been something huge to be proud of as a family, wouldn't it? And it would have been groundbreaking.
How was it received in Plymouth, the initial call up, and then when it all went quiet afterwards? What was the kind of situation and mood in the city?
Well, there's some of the team sheets printed in the papers, and Jack talked about the story in that Daily Mail article in 1978, which is a remarkable article. And we can imagine everyone was going nuts. And like I say, it happened a couple of years previously with Jack Hill. It was huge for a club like Plymouth. I mean, at the time, we were actually really trying hard to get up to the top flight. We had to start lower down because the Football League formed with northern clubs and a few London clubs. So we're always having to start at the bottom and work our way up. But the sort of team that we put together at that point was pretty remarkable. So there was real hope in the 20s that we were going to get to the top flight. So when stuff like this happened, it was massive, and people were talking about it. Jack said there was a buzz. And then, when it all goes quiet, that just people couldn't talk about it. Jack sort of said it himself, that everyone went quiet. They couldn't look him in the eye. So imagine people like Bob Jack and his teammates not able to talk about it. He said he sort of heard round about. So there must have been some discussion about, with those closer friends. And I wonder if he and Sammy chatted about it, because Sammy was overlooked, I think more because of geography, but by the Scotland selectors. But he was certainly good enough to play for Scotland. So the two of them must have been... And Argyle fans were gutted. It was mentioned in the 60s that those two players never got the cap they deserved. There's one reporter in Plymouth who wrote under the name of Pilgrim, and he was the sort of Chris Errington of the day. His real name's Pat Twyford, he's on the left. And this was a quote I found quite early on, but then I was looking for it in the archives I found it in an academic article, and I was like, I've got, it was verified, I was happy with it, but I wanted to make sure I could see it.
See it for yourself,
yeah.
Absolutely.
And it was great when I did. He said, readers may expect a comment upon the Argyle club's announcement that Jack Lesley was not chosen as reserve forward for England. Unfortunately, my pen is under a ban in this matter. He said, but I may say that a mistake was made in London and transmitted to me. Anyway, Lesley was at that time playing quite well enough to be chosen. And what I found in that newspaper on the same page, they've got a little gossip column of snippets, and this writer, apart from when Jack started, never mentioned his colour. And just in that little gossip snippet, it's just near that quote, it says, maybe of interest to readers that Jack Lesley, Argyle's famous inside left, is the only gentleman of colour in the Football League. And I thought that's Pilgrim, Pat Twyford, telling us the reason. Because he was a huge Jack Lesley fan and would keep writing that, Jack should win an England cap. He'd been equally buzzing for Jack at his selection.
So what happened in the aftermath then? He's been deselected, maybe feels humiliated, feels aggrieved, feels sad, feels upset. How did he bounce back from that?
Well, I think he used football. I mean, it's impossible. It's impossible for us to know exactly how he felt. He never complained about it, did he? He wasn't that sort of man. But I think it would be it'd be wrong to think that it didn't affect him because, yeah.
I can just remember Grandad saying to us at that time, he just loved playing football. And if he wasn't going to be allowed to play for his country, which he would have, it's the pinnacle of his career, he will go out and play for Plymouth and he will score goals for Plymouth. And that's exactly what he did. And that is how he fought back.
That says it all about Jack, I think. It's a remarkable attitude. And I think when he was playing, that's it. He clearly did. His best years were ahead of him in spite of what happened. And in fact, when you read all the match reports and then lots of quotes in the national press kind of saying, you know, Jack Lesley, one of, if not the best inside lefts in the country. Jack Lesley should be in the England team. You know, there's one in the Telegraph where he's in the journalist sort of dream 11, and the Daily Mail, of course, who said had he been white, he would have been a certain England international. So it was all there, but he just bounced. You know, they were playing match after match. But I do wonder if I think when you read the 1978 article, you know, again, he's not complaining about it. He was just sort of getting on with it, but telling it like it is. But he said, I was good enough. I deserved to play for my country. And he was a real patriot as well. So I think maybe looking back, it might have affected him more, maybe. But he certainly never, he never put that burden on his family, I think, even though they have carried it with them. Particularly, your mum was very angry, wasn't she, about?
Very angry, yeah.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the press articles almost tooting his horn. It's all not a campaign, was it? But it was more a case of highlighting, this is a very talented player who should be playing for England. Why do you think it didn't go further than that in terms of not just a few articles here and there? Why wasn't there more of a campaign or more of people sticking up for Jack almost?
Yeah, well, there was the odd. I mean, the only sort of version of what would now be a sort of social media storm was one paper, the Daily Herald, which was a left-wing paper. There's a letter that writes into it. What happened with Jack Lesley? Was he chosen? And so they rang up the FA. And the FA said, oh, no, he wasn't chosen, even though his name was in the papers. And the Press Association, they rang up the Press Association, and Press Association said, yeah, he absolutely was picked. Yeah. But that is as far as it went. No other paper, certainly not the locals or the nationals, apart from this one, wanted to pick up on it. It was just that not spoken about. And no one, I guess, was going to stick up for Jack and I think he knew that,
Even still, as you said, he continued to play with distinction and play really well, continued to score goals, and a few years later became Argyle's captain, the first black captain of a Football League club. A few years after, he won promotion with Argyle. So when you talk about mental strength and resilience, I mean, those things shed a light on that more than anything, don't they?
Yeah, I think he had to prove himself to be beyond other players and to win the trust of his teammates and the board. And he had to be exceptional to get that position, which he obviously was because he did. He was first given the captaincy in 1928 when I think it was when his mate Fred Titmus, who joined Argyle, who had also played for England before joining Argyle. He was injured and Jack stepped in, and then he was given the captaincy permanently after we won promotion, and that first season after promotion was a struggle, a bit like this season, I think, possibly. But Fred Titmuss was injured towards the end, and Jack came in as captain for, I think, about the last 8 or 9 games, something like that, and helped to drag us. In fact, Bob Jack said, it's down to Jack that we're, still in the division effectively. And the next season led Argyle to its highest league position to date, which is 4th in the 2nd division. So they were doing phenomenally well and playing some really incredible clubs, and some lots of the match reports show how brave he was as a player. He wasn't just a goal scorer, he was everywhere on the pitch. He was amazing.
Well, you mentioned in the book about the standing ovation he got at White Hart Lane against Tottenham Hotspur. What was the background to that, just briefly?
There's loads of reports where in the 20s, and there were no substitutes, so you basically would have to hobble on. You'd have to, unless you got actually broken a leg, often players would be carried off and have to be patched up. Often it was goalkeepers because they got clattered and someone would have to go back in goal. And Jack was always the player who would kind of fall back from the forward line into midfield and defence, and often reports saying he was doing the work of 2 players. And there's a couple of games where that happened against Spurs, and that one was at White Hart Lane. I think it was like a 0-0 draw, and at the end, and Jack spoke about this in an article later in life, one of the Spurs players pointed out that the standing ovation that was happening in the stadium, and he said that is for you, Jack. So imagine that, being at an away ground and getting that kind of ovation. And there were many examples of that. And in Jack's time, we were unbeaten against Spurs.
It's very good. And on the subject of Spurs and their rivals, we're going to come on to his time at West Ham. This is after he retired and he worked in the boot room there.
Yeah.
Now, he would have looked after the boots of World Cup winners. Now, we're talking a few days after the death of Bobby Charlton, and World Cup 1996 team have come to the fore again, and he would have looked after the likes of Bobby Moore and Martin Peters. What would that have been like for him in terms of, because we know that he didn't talk about his career with these players. So what would it have been like for him knowing that he would have maybe had some knowledge or expertise and also experience, but didn't speak with it with those players?
I think he'd when we spoke to people like Clyde Best, who was a pioneering black player for West Ham, and Trevor Brooking, he would sort of help them out, but he never made a big thing and never really talked to them about his playing career. Some of the younger players who perhaps had more time, or maybe some of the other people at the staff would have known. Ron Greenwood, who gave him the job, West Ham manager, who also managed England, he was aware of Jack as a player. That's why he gave him a job. And there are lots of examples of players of that time going and doing, sweeping the terraces. Bill Harper, who was a mate of Jack's here at Argyle, Harper's named after him. Was doing similar jobs around here. So yeah, I find it remarkable he didn't really talk about it much, but some of the younger players he did a bit, and he was obviously really, really popular. And although it is a sort of bittersweet ending to his career when you sort of just put it in those stark terms, I think it was a job that kept him going. I mean, I'll ask Lesley and Lyn about this because you remember some of those times, I think.
He loved it. Again, it's just that love of football, and I think to be there and in that sort of kind of atmosphere, he absolutely loved working there. I don't know. I don't know if you can add anything to that.
Well, even just cleaning the boots, he did a good job. And if there was any studs missing, he made sure he went and got them all repaired, and they had to be just right. And so he put his heart into doing that job.
Yeah, he clearly took pride in it. Remember everything that the players at the time have said. And he was there till he was 82, so and he was quite a heavy smoker, wasn't he? Jack and Sammy. Sammy Black, did he used to play with a cigarette behind his ear? Yeah. So yeah, it was, that helped to keep him going, I think. Not the cigarette, the job.
So, we here, we're celebrating Jack Lesley and through the book. We're talking about legacy. What would you say if you could, for those who obviously didn't know him, if you could describe in maybe 3 words, what 3 words would you use to describe him?
Oh, but there's only 3 words I'm allowed to use. I'm looking at Lyn, and he had a motto, and it's the name of, it's what I entitled, I think it's chapter 2, talking about him as a player. And I think it was also describes him as a person, and that's his motto. And he used to pass this on to the young West Ham players. It was go, guts, goals. Just, you've got to have drive, you've got to be brave, and if you're a footballer, you've got to score goals. That's what you've got to do. That's. I think it sums him up.
No, absolutely. I think that rounds off our discussion quite nicely, I feel. I'd like to invite the audience, if anyone has any questions, we'll do our best to answer them.
Yeah, Sam from the National Football Museum. Hello, Sam. Hey. Yay! Do you want to give Sam the microphone? And yeah.
Hey, I can just roam with this. So, do you want to just point out when people are going to hand up for questions, and I'll dash over?
Yeah. Any questions?
Can I ask something about without getting too political about it, but the politics of the FA in the 20s? That was when the women's game was effectively totally embargoed, was it not? Is the Lesley situation sort of just an offshoot of that policy of sort of inertia?
I think it was sort of stereotypes that the FA were old fuddy-duddies and have been for many years. They really are. If you read, what, not every single one. I think what is really one of the interesting things is that Jack was selected. So some of those FA selectors in that first meeting picked him on merit, would have known he was black because he was a famous player. And there's lots of connections of those selectors with either geographical areas where Jack would have played, or there was a guy from Millwall. We've played Millwall several times. You have mates who played for Millwall. So some of those selectors actually just, they didn't consider it an issue. They just thought, here's a great player who was born in London, let's get him in the England team. But there were prevailing attitudes. We were talking about there's the stuff I looked at in the book about sort of military selection of recruiting officers in the First World War. So some recruiting officers would go, fine, you can come and fight for your country, and others would turn black men away. And there was actually stuff written down that men who were not of pure European descent they could not be officers. So Walter Toll sort of broke through that that rule. So there were a lot of attitudes around, and lots of examples of discrimination. So although in terms of football it wasn't sort of a written law, I think there was a feeling that, well, I can remember when Viv Anderson got selected, there was a certainly a feeling among a section of fans, let's be plain about it, racist fans, who didn't think a black player should play for England. And that would certainly have been true, and certainly was true, in Jack's time. So it was quite a mix. But I think that's the pressure that caused the change of heart. It was a feeling amongst those kind of people, and I think external people, who just couldn't accept this. Hopefully that answers the question, Simon, in some way, shape or form.
Yeah, I'm quite interested in whether you had time or were able to look at archives which were more social. I'm sort of like big into social memory, social history, and you mentioned how viewing things through like the modern morality or sense of right and wrong isn't always the accurate way to see it, and we've had accurately described the vitriol that was thrown at the family despite this man being glorified on the pitch. I wondered if there were any accounts of, other than say the newspapers, of local feeling around Jack, whether there is, whether that, if not, that's something that would be an interesting dive into, because obviously what gets said behind closed doors and in public can be different. And as I said to you when we spoke earlier, so I've got family history with it. It's a very, obviously it's a nuanced thing, but is there any evidence of what the local feeling was towards Jack? Because it was very, like you say, almost monolithic in its racial makeup, Plymouth at the time.
Yeah, no, there isn't. I mean, I'd love to find any sort of references, but there's nothing I found about Jack's reception in Plymouth that weren't positive, because he was welcomed to. Yeah, might be important, Tony. He gets a pass. He started it all off. Yeah, in a word, no. But I found lots of pieces of information about how he was so well liked. But I think that's because, of course, they were going to report those. There was the odd thing where I think I mentioned sort of specific barracking of Jack, but it doesn't mention his race. There are lots of things that I found more generally about incidents that happened to black people around the riots and just attitudes around the time. Lots of reports in national papers that I found, lots of stuff about the post-World War I riots, attitudes towards other sporting characters that are full of kind of stereotypes. Yeah, so, I mean, but I'd love to, there's always more stuff to be found. Oh, lots.
We'll go to you first, and we'll come to you, and we'll come to you after.
Okay. So in the middle, if I remember, is it Rob? Yes.
Thanks, yeah. I'm sure as you know, the first Scottish black international was a guy called Andrew Watson in the 19th century.
Yes.
And he was a bit of a star at the time. Got a few caps for Scotland, probably would have played more if he hadn't moved to England. But he was from a quite middle class, wealthy upbringing. His dad was wealthy, I think he was even related to Gladstone. But he was still a mixed race person. So from your studies of like pre-Windrush black people in Britain, were they treated a bit better if they were from a higher social class? And do you think Jack would have been treated maybe differently if he had come from a wealthy family?
Well, I certainly think he would have been treated differently. I think he would have probably been able to speak to people about, even if he couldn't speak about the England selection, he would have been able to talk to people about, for example, moving on from Argyle and maybe going to back to a London club. So I certainly think that would have had an impact. I think it's interesting that you mentioned that also at the same time. In Jack's time, a Welsh player was similar, a guy called Eddie Paris, who his dad was also a black immigrant who married a white Welsh woman, and he did win one cap. And there's one article that I think it was Andy who found this, where the Daily Mirror were talking about Eddie and Jack and saying, they're both men of colour, but they're as British as anyone. Of course, the FA didn't think that, whereas the Welsh and Scottish selectors did. I don't think Eddie had any, aristocratic connections. So, but yeah, I don't know if that would have meant he'd have won a cap, but would it have made his life easier? Yeah, sure, definitely.
We'll go to you.
What was your favourite part of the book, like you researched and wrote about?
My favourite thing to do, I loved going into the archives because it was, just pouring through that detail. But my favourite my favourite thing to do was I spent 2 days with Lyn and Lesley talking through Jack's entire life. And that was fascinating because we hadn't, I think partly because of COVID, we hadn't really had much time. We talked on the phone. I'd done a bit of research, but talking to them about his entire life from start to finish. And they'd often, I remember when I talked to Gloria saying, well, we didn't really talk to Jack much, and you don't really talk to your grandparents until it's too late. But there are things that you both all remembered that really made the story what it is, and paints a picture of a human being. It's not just, he played on Saturday and did this. So that was, and sort of finding out some of the ups and downs in his sort of personal life on the way, and how that might have affected his career, and then when he ran a pub in Truro before going back to London, that was possibly my most fun chapter. And there's also the game against Arsenal in the Cup. We'd beaten Manchester United, and then we played Arsenal away, and that game is very funny. I'll leave it there. Well, fun, yeah. But maybe I could ask Lesley and Lyn about the pub very quickly, because it is quite funny. What was he like at running a pub?
Awful. He was a very friendly man, and people had come in, and he was, because it was in Truro, the pub, but they knew him. He was well known for playing for Plymouth Argyle, and they'd start talking football, and he'd get out his medals to show them, and the next thing you know, he's given away all these medals that us as a family are devastated. We have got some, we're wearing them tonight, but he gave away an awful lot of his medals to people who just came into the pub and said what a brilliant player he was.
He also bought them all drinks. So even all the profits were going on the people that were coming in, buying everyone a drink.
Yeah, that business did not last very long. But he wasn't like as a couple, they were not idiots. They realised that they needed to move on, and they did, and actually bought a house outright in London. So although you didn't get paid that well playing football, he was certainly earning more than he would as a boilermaker, which was his trade. It was basically sort of riveting metal, which is what he did through the First World War, while learning his football trade. Yeah, and both, because he was an apprentice. Yeah, through the Second World War, which would have been in the East End, worse than it was in Plymouth. Like Sammy was working in the armaments depot, wasn't he? Yeah. So the pair of them, I think, through the Second World War, doing really tough jobs and crucial jobs as well.
And he worked in a pub as well.
Oh,
Don't panic on quick.
He worked
in a pub as well.
Was he any good?
I don't know, because I don't really know. All I know he worked in the pub.
I will just ask, because you did tell me what Sammy was like as a person. So a lot of Argyle fans will know the name Sammy Black, a legend as much as Jack, top scorer. Jack's fourth on the list. Sammy, still our all-time greatest goal scorer.
Yeah.
What was he like as a man?
Very laid back and very quiet. Yeah. If my friends would come in and he'd be behind his paper, and I'd say, Dad, this is so-and-so, and he'd go, all right. And that'd be it. Very shy all his life.
It's remarkable when you think he was an explosive footballer. There's a picture in the book, which actually you showed me, which is just brilliant, of Sammy Black sort of mid-air. Just, yeah.
That's a brilliant photo, absolutely. You're at the back there. Sorry, mate.
Yep.
Yep.
Sorry. I think first I'd like to say thank you, because I'm actually not a Plymouth local. I'm a university student, and I didn't know much about Plymouth at all before I came down here. And then I realised, wow, Plymouth Argyle, big stadium, big culture, everyone loves it down here. So for me, to be even really here, and obviously at the statue unveiling earlier this year, I can't actually remember where it was, but it's actually been really eye-opening. So I want to say thank you, because learning about this and sitting here reading, you know, the stuff on the wall, and I'm like, wow, like I can't even think or imagine what it is that Jack would have kind of been through. So firstly, I'd like to say thank you, because it's been really eye-opening. Obviously, I'm black, so as a young black footballer, you know, as an aspiring footballer when I was younger, obviously, you know, hearing Jack play, you know, for a professional team and obviously get his call up, and then obviously, you know, it's kind of like a dream almost. And you know, everyone as a child, they think about superheroes, think about Superman, Batman, you know, and obviously more recently Black Panther. And I think it's kind of almost in a way, like, to me, if I was a child and I knew about him that young, he would have been a hero to me. And I wondered, really random question, but if there was any kind of...
Sorry about that.
If there was any kind of work to kind of, almost like a cartoon or something to kind of have him seen in that light. Because for me, if I was able to see that growing up, again, obviously, you know, thankfully I've been blessed to see a lot of, you know, great black football players up on screen. I'm an Arsenal fan, so not so much the Man U side of things.
I might not answer your question now.
Probably should have kept that one quiet. But obviously, you know, the Henrys, the Ashley Coles. There's too many to name. Ian Wright, and the list goes on. But I was wondering if there's any kind of works almost towards like a cartoon to kind of almost make it more digestible for kids to almost kind of see that kind of heroic aspect of him, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, you do a lot of work, don't you, with Greg in schools talking about Jack's story. It's something that I spoke with you guys before earlier, didn't I, about, like, in schools, especially, like, in our generation, I'm sure in yours as well, like, when you're learning about history and black history, it's more from a case of the American side of things and slavery and civil rights, and maybe black history in the UK is maybe not taught that well. So seeing these kind of stories come to light and come to the fore and really kind of garner that kind of mainstream attention, so you're talking about role models and people to aspire to, you know, this is a man here who, you know, even when I was growing up and my parents and things like that, wouldn't have known about Jack Lesley, and it just, you know, would have instilled that sense of pride and that sense of, you know, the aspiration. So, say the fact that, you know, Matt has, you know, worked so hard to bring this story to light, we see the statue out there as well, it's only really going to inspire our generation, but also the next generations as well, and having people to look up to and understanding our history, not just from an American perspective, but also from the UK as well. So it's a really good question, and so I know you do a lot of work in schools and, you know, telling Jack's story to the younger generation as well, don't you?
Yeah, try as much as we can. Basically, we, you know, Greg and I are asked to come and talk about it. We do. We've been to schools and we talked to the under-18s here and the under-18s at West Ham recently, which was really great. There's a great bunch of young players here at the moment. They were much sparkier than the West Ham lads, or maybe that was because the West Ham talk was at 9:30 in the morning and they were like 17. But there's also there is more stuff coming through. There's a book by a black football journalist, Damien Johnson, I think, that's recently come out, that's aimed at children, and it's about black sporting heroes, and there's a double page on Jack. So I think it's really important that more stuff like that comes through. So and as these stories get recognised, you can see it in. I've got a son who's about to turn 4, and just the variety, the diversity in stories that he's reading now is massive compared to, you know, what I had when I was growing up.
Thank you.
Little ripple. An awkward ripple is better than no ripple at all.
Hi. So I know that Plymouth Argyle is doing work with the University of Plymouth, sort of like EDI work to promote these things. And I guess my question is, if you had one lesson to pick from the book that you wanted us to go home with tonight, what would that be?
I think it is what I was slightly talking about before, is how what happened to Jack really affected him, and thinking about the treatment, because he might have outwardly have brushed it off and got on with playing football, and no matter what he would have said about it, that period of time would have been awful. As soon as he had any moments to think about what might have been, it's thinking about that impact, and there's the impact on the family, there's the impact on other players, of course, and that all follows on from that. But it follows on from the way he was treated in that period, because if footballers always have to have tough conversations, from managers, if they're being told you're not going to make the grade. It's a tough business. But you imagine you're a player that is getting plaudits across the country, and you're approaching your peak, and this happens, and then that's pulled away from you. I think to treat anyone like that is, it's appalling. So I think it's thinking about that, because I hadn't thought about it as much as I should have done until I actually thought about, those days. Yes.
The one thing he really hated was injustice. And if he saw anyone being ill-treated unjustly, he'd always stick up for them. He couldn't stand that. Although he put up with what he did and didn't seem to get bitter or anything, anyone else, he hated injustice.
It's remarkable that he wasn't able to speak up for himself, really. You've told me a great story that follows on from that, in how he looked after Sammy Black.
Well, Sammy Black was quite a lot smaller than Grandad and was quite often picked on. And he'd go over and have a quick word with whoever it was and say, "You carry on and you'll have me to answer to." And he stood up for him. Yeah.
Yeah, I think things like that, because he was a gentleman on the pitch. Apparently he didn't foul or didn't cheat, but you didn't get on the wrong side of him.
He was a big, powerful man.
Yeah.
That's as well. And obviously as well, I think, as we're doing today, we're having a conversation, and I think a lot of prejudice comes from ignorance and not educating themselves, or taking the steps to educate themselves to learn about other cultures and other backgrounds. So to answer your question in terms of lessons, inspiring conversation and learning about other people, other backgrounds, other cultures, because you will learn so much more just through having a conversation, and hopefully, as you say, what we're doing today and moving forward, just continuing to break down those barriers, which obviously we live in a society today which obviously much more multicultural, much more tolerant, but as we all know, there's still so much more work to do. So the more conversations that we can have with people, as we're doing tonight, it's only going to serve us better as a society. So I think that's my takeaway from your question.
Yeah.
Anyone else got any other questions? You're in the back there.
Yeah, the times that Jack was playing were horrendous times. 20s was depressions, Battle of Cable Street. Then you had the rise of Mussolini, Spanish Civil War, Nazis in Germany, all running through that period. I was wondering if you managed to find out who the selectors were.
I know exactly who they are. They're listed in the book. They are. I didn't find much else. There are a list of names and where they represented. So there was the, I think the chair of Millwall and various. So they're all listed in the minutes, and I found out various things about some of them. And in fact, there's one of them. Actually, it's not one of the selectors, but one of the last books that I read was Sir Frederick Wall, who was the FA secretary, and he put out the call. It was his job to put out the call for players. And if you read his book, there's a quote in this book, and it really showed a sort of very kind of old school attitude towards footballers. There was a whole kind of division between the amateur game and the professional game at the time. in that team that Jack should have been a part of. There were amateur players selected. And yeah, it was kind of saying, we know what we're doing. We're really open about it, but you shouldn't really know about what we do in our meetings. There's a sort of a quote that he said that was really contradictory. So yeah, they were generally speaking a group of older football administrators who I'm sure each of them had different and individual attitudes towards race that they wouldn't put in writing. But their attitudes are there in some sort of in some instances. So and there is a bit about that in the book when I sort of talk about the England selection and that sort of journey.
All right, so it's interesting to know that you've got the names, because I can wander off on a different tangent myself then, because there are records of, for instance, BUJ memberships, BUF memberships, British Union of Fascists.
Okay.
And that was the kind of level that their membership came from.
Oh, yeah. That would be interesting. Too late to put in the book, but it would. But I would be really interested to know, because you just, yeah. I'm sure, because I've had the odd comment saying, you know, how dare you accuse these FA officials of being racist? I mean, yeah. I'm. The weird thing is, individually, I'm not, because actually, almost certainly some were, but actually almost certainly some weren't, because they selected Jack. Collectively, they ended up making a decision that was racist. But individually, we can't sort of say, oh, that guy, but you might find out exactly which one it was.
Sorry, can I? Oh, I might take someone else's question.
So we'll come to you after. I will come to you as well after.
Just on that, you know, trying to just put a label on it. Is it that in those times it was more paternalistic, or even just straight patriarchal? We know what's best.
Well, I think there was a lot of that, but there was also kind of stereotypes. There was an article that I found from about the mid-1930s, written by an amateur player called, actually it was written in the 70s, but written by a guy who was an amateur player in the late 20s and 30s. So he would have known Jack, and he was writing about the stereotypes around black players and why, this was in the mid-70s, why a black player won't make it for England. And he was entirely wrong, of course, because those sort of stereotypes were things that any black player who's played for England sort of smashes, and Jack smashes in terms of their sort of attitude on the pitch and how they deal with that adversity. And I thought it was remarkable that this writer, a guy called Bernard Joy, had written that in the 70s, but would have seen a player like Jack in the 20s and 30s. I'm pretty sad that Bernard Joy actually played for England. I think it was the last amateur to play for England in 1936, and yet Jack didn't get the chance to play. So there were a couple more questions.
Yes, we'll start with you first, and then we'll come to you after.
This is Rachel, who's doing a lot of work with the Hidden Figures project around lots of characters, like Jack and Jimmy Peters.
Yeah. First of all, I want to say thank you very much, Matt, for the work you've done, and yourself as well. I've got incredible admiration for you guys for what you've done, bringing Jack's name into everyone's minds. And you took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say, what a lot of people don't know is that you're actually a dedicated steering committee member of the Hidden Figures of Plymouth, a project that was started by Wonder Zoo, where you are working with us on Jack Lesley. And actually a couple of the students from the uni who've just spoken have identified what we've identified, in that there's something special about Plymouth, in that here you are fighting for, you know, Jack's name to be known, and the other names as well. We also have Jimmy Peters, the rugby player, and other people that we want people to know about. And I'm very proud to be from Plymouth in that respect, to call Plymouth my hometown, because if we look back at that time and think that both Jack and Jimmy were comfortable enough to live in Plymouth and to be welcomed by the city of Plymouth, and to to raise their families and things like that. I think it's incredible, and I think it's something that we in Plymouth are not celebrating enough. The question I had was how you talked about Jack's life, and I just can't wait to read the book. But do you go before that? What about his ancestors? What do we know about Jack's father, his grandfather, and their lives? Do we know anything, or where do we go from there?
We know a little, and we know that Jack's dad was also... Jack was christened John Francis Lesley after his dad, who was a sailor from Jamaica. But actually, and this is stories from Lesley and Lyn, because there's not much in the record books, and that's not for the want of trying. And I think some things are a little bit red herrings in the records. But John Francis Lesley Senior, ran away to sea from Jamaica at the age of 12, and that was not uncommon. The few sort of records, there's a few examples of similar journeys, because obviously they're getting, treated really badly in Jamaica. It was, slavery might have ended, but life was not easy. So, it can't have been easy if you are 12 years old and you want to, jump on a boat and escape for a new life, which is what he did. So there's stuff like that we know, and we know that he sort of sailed the world and settled in London and married Annie Regler, and they had 3 children. Jack was the youngest, and one of them, the middle daughter, sadly died. But obviously kind of a very resilient, tough family. The mum and dad supported Jack in coming to Plymouth. You imagine a lot of people might have said, oh, you've got offers in London, why do you... So I think there's enough there to know a bit about the family background and what they were like. I'd love to go further. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole and I didn't find very much, but enough to start it off. Yeah.
Fantastic. I'll come to you at the back.
Thank you very much. I know that obviously everyone's kind of itching to go home. It's about that time that's getting late.
What?
So I'm making my question quick and sweet. It's more of an acknowledgement to Matt actually for going through and writing this book. For someone like me who's actually was born and raised here in Plymouth, and having the chance to actually go to some of the games when I was younger, and till now I'm still a season ticket holder just outside. But I just wanted to say thank you, because obviously I never had the chance to see any of these figures unless it was like the more recent people that you see on TV. And probably me learning, I lived in the Middle East for a little bit and coming back, and now I'm relearning my history about Plymouth and actually appreciating a lot more. And now I'm fortunate to be in a position where I'm sharing a lot of the Black history stories and doing more for the Black community here in Plymouth, alongside actually a few people that are in this room. We're doing a lot of collaborations. My main question is, what advice, or what would you say for the next generation? What advice would you give them as far as like the legacy goes with the campaign?
I think that's tough. For the actual campaign, I think there has to be a legacy, and a lot of that is around the work that other people are doing, because Greg and I will carry on doing stuff because we can't say no if someone asks us. It feels like the right thing to do. But equally, I think it's great working with people like Rachel and Chi and Slane from Wonder Zoo, and we're going to be working together with the Box, which I'm really excited about, digging into the archives, the film and TV archives. So I think it's important to carry it on, but it can't just be, two middle-aged white blokes like me and Greg. We're Argyle fans, and we've come to it as Argyle fans and have absolutely loved it, and we will carry on. But I think that's an important thing, is to work with other people. Would you? Is that fair?
No, absolutely. I think is just continuing the great work that Matt and Greg have done, and unearthing other stories as well. Who else could we find and have other role models that young people can aspire to, and as I say, the work that you've done has really shed a light on that. And I think we live in a time where we're more conscious of these things now. So the more you say people in history, the more we can shed that light on their stories and tell their stories, and act as role models. And even us sitting here today, we can be role models for the next generation, our families, our nieces, nephews, etc. So I think we've all got a duty, everyone here really, and everyone in society, to not just shed a light on the past, but also try and take that baton on to the future as well. So we say we've all got a role to play in that.
Shall we have, probably the last couple of questions, Rob?
Yeah.
Oh.
Obviously, he does some great research, and I know Argyle Archive have as well. I've seen a few bits on Twitter. Do you think there's any possibility, like carrying on with the story, that there might be a possibility of some kind of museum at Home Park, somewhere you could take a child around and just show around some displays? Because there's plenty of nice stories that people just don't know enough about.
Well, yeah, and there's lots. We've been talking about Jack, but one of the great things that I really enjoyed in the research was finding out about all these other characters. Some of them I've mentioned: Jack Cock, Jack Hill, David Jack. There's so many. Like really, I know they're all called Jack. I mean, and there's Bob Jack. It's just baffling. Hopefully, I've tried to be as clear on that in the book, so hopefully you don't get confused. But yeah, I think obviously Jack's story is fundamentally important, but I think there's a lot of Argyle fans in here, and there are some brilliant characters and brilliant stories from that time, and I would love more of that to be shared and seen. I would love there to be some storytelling that shares the stories of Bob Jack, who was here for 30-something years, 34 years as a manager. I'm looking at Stephen Green's on screen, who should, and as a player before then, and Sammy Black, who, whether it's a statue or I think there's something else that tells our story and tells it through, because we've had some phenomenal characters over the years, and some amazing moments, and particularly that team in the 20s was nuts. Maybe take one more question before. Oh, Ken.
Any chance of you and Craig coming along to Senior Greens? That's all I'm going to answer.
Oh yeah. We'll come to Senior Greens. Yes, absolutely, easy one. Okay, we can probably do one. Oh, yep. Okay, two, but that's it.
I just wanted to say that there's more than one type of prejudice, and you mentioned a name just now who comes up as an example. Sir Frederick Wall was the secretary of the FA, and obviously he showed prejudice towards Jack Lesley. It was he that facilitated that Argyle got a professional club, because all the clubs in England didn't want Argyle to be in the professional leagues. And he'd got to know the old Argyle Football Club because they'd broken an FA rule. And he got to know the club and became very pro-Argyle. And so when the clubs didn't want to let Argyle into the league, he, as the secretary of the FA, recommended that they all let Argyle into the league, and he made the difference. And Argyle got into the first division of the Southern League, they jumped the second division, due to his help. So he helped a prejudice of Plymouth. Plymouth has been prejudiced because of where its geography placed. The club had to pay bribes to the other teams in the league, or agree to play matches on a certain day to get into the league. So I just want to say that there's all types of prejudice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different, but yeah, I mean, I think all of us I grew up in Plymouth, and we've
Well, it's ignorance, isn't it? That's what it's all about.
But I think also for them, you got the establishment of the league that had been around for a while, and Plymouth were trying to break through that and make their way. And they were obviously working really hard to do that. And you can see that by the team that they put together in the 20s, that 6 years in a row we were runners-up in the 3rd Division South, which meant we didn't get promoted. So there were some gutting moments for Jack and his teammates along the way, and eventually they got promoted. And these days, I think we'd have had a good chance of being right up there in that period, because we had some amazing players. But it was a struggle, and we've always had a struggle with geography. There's the story about Jack, the team experimenting with air travel, and then the football. The players didn't fly, just the VIPs, but Jack did fly back as captain, on this flight, but the Football League banned air travel after that, so we were still having to get 8 hours on the train to Stoke or whatever. So, yes. I think I said one more, but that has to be it. Chris?
Thank you, Matt.
Hang on, let's get the mic.
Yeah, we'll just get the mic to you, Chris.
Yeah, and the two ladies alluded to it a bit, that Plymouth has really rallied around the campaign from start to finish. I know I've spoken to Matt a couple of times, and I think even you were surprised how quickly, from the inception of the campaign, how quickly the money came in to actually erect the statue. And I think, I'm quite proud, I'm a Plymouthian, Jana through and through, Argyle supporter since 1969, so this means an awful lot to me. And I think we're one of the few football clubs that would have brought this to fruition this quickly. And I think the turnout tonight and the way the statue and the whole campaign has grown in Plymouth, and I think there's lots more growing to do. I know, being a governor of 3 primary schools in the town, because they know the book's going to go into the gallery on the Barbican, they've already booked me 3 primary schools. I haven't even mentioned it yet. I've got me doing half-hour talks in the next 3 weeks. So, yeah, did that take me by surprise? How quickly people were happy to pledge the money?
Well, it did take us by surprise. We thought it would be a real slog, particularly in COVID, but obviously it just captured people's imagination. And I think I don't want to speak for them, probably the older fans thought that that's great that the story's finally being told, but for the younger fans and for fans like me who are somewhere in the middle, where, you know, our memories are of legends like, you know, Tommy Tynan and Kevin Hodges, and then through the 90s of Steve Castle and Ronnie Mojay, of course, who's been an incredible supporter. I just think the fact that the story hadn't been sort of celebrated before in a major way, I think made people, it's the right time for people to, too late, but everyone felt like it had to be celebrated now. So that's been inspiring. As an Argyle fan, it's been brilliant. I've absolutely loved it. So thank you all. Well done. Yeah, that's great. Well done.